much for the kind words. So let me just share my screen, see if it works. Okay, there we go. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. It is my great pleasure to be here. So as we do not have too much time, I'll just go right into it. So just very briefly about the outline. So first I want to provide a description of essentially what has happened until now. So from the first proposal to the initial reactions, and then the revised proposal, which I call Libra 2.0, and then provide an analysis of Libra 2.0 and what the implications might be in the future. So does it actually work? There we go. So there had already been quite a few rumors starting in 2018 about Facebook being interested in working on digital assets, cryptocurrencies, on blockchain technology. So you could tell that by looking at some of the job hirings or ads that they posted, looking for blockchain engineers and experts, but also the acquisitions they made. So for example, they acquired blockchain company CHEN. But it was really only last year in June when they published the first white paper where essentially the world really woke up essentially to what eventually became the Libra Project. So the white paper was published in June 2019, and it really took the world by, I say, surprise, in the sense that it was a very ambitious endeavor. It's about creating a simple, as it's mentioned in the white paper, global currency, as well as digital financial infrastructure to empower billions of people. Now, just briefly looking at the key components, so there's three of them. First, there would be a so-called Libra coin. So essentially new digital currency that would be packed to a basket of national currencies, where the collateral would be managed by a large investment fund called the Libra Reserve. And that would essentially be the main unit of account of this entire system. Second, there would be the Libra blockchain, which essentially is a shared business network with also smart contract capabilities. So you would have the option to essentially build programmable money, as well as automate certain financial instruments and contracts. But most importantly, it would really be an open ecosystem that would also invite third-party developers to actually build on top of it, rather than just being yet another closed enterprise blockchain, if you will. And that network would be governed by the Libra Association, a Swiss-based foundation that at the launch, or at least at the announcement, comprised, I think it was 27 members. And so that association would be the independent governing body of that entire system. Now, why was this a quite surprising announcement? It actually took me by surprise as well. It's because it was a lot more ambitious than I would have anticipated. So I was expecting just another blockchain project, but in the end, it turned out to be something much more significant for the following reasons. So first, I think actually since Bitcoin, that this is the biggest experiment in private money. So money that is not issued by a sovereign state, that has its own unit of account. And so unlike Bitcoin here in this case would be issued by an association comprised of private enterprises. And the fact that made this so significant is the sheer scale of the association, and so the global reach as well. So just the fact that Facebook already through its entire product base covers more than 1/3 of the world population. And then you also count in payment service companies like Visa and MasterCard that also span the globe. So it's just private money at really an unprecedented scale, I would say, since the days of colonialism, where we had the East India Company. And even that, I think, wasn't really attending the same or attaching the same scale. Now, what's also really interesting about this proposal is what I call the distributed financial market infrastructure, or FMI. So the fact that it's an open network design that actually invites users to freely and openly transact on it, but also invites other participants and primarily developers to really build on top of it. So really that open ecosystem, unlike those generally closed platforms for payments. And what's really important about that is also the distributed governance aspect, where it was a stated goal within the white paper that the organization, so the Libra Association, would actually plan to move towards a more decentralized form of governance, what they call permissionlessness, which is something I've actually never heard besides cryptocurrencies when it comes to financial market infrastructure. And also, if you look at the design of the actual network, so from the descriptions of the technical white paper, it was actually very well thought out, and in a way that actually really leverages the key benefits that blockchains should genuinely offer. So users would be able to run nodes to independently verify and validate transactions. There would actually be distributed consensus, unlike in many enterprise blockchains where you have one authority that essentially processes transactions. Here we would have all the members of the association that would collectively process these transactions. And then I think really one of the key distinguishing features compared to other traditional payment systems is the ability of users to create wallets without having to ask anyone for permission. So essentially create accounts without essentially having an account provider. And what that then also does is what we call self-custody, so that users would be able to store their assets on their own without having to go through a custodian. Now, really what this was all about is creating nothing short really of a revolutionary, let's say, global financial infrastructure with a new digital currency privately issued. And so I think it is not very surprising that it didn't really take long for people to react. And the reactions were overwhelmingly negative, I think it's fair to say. So the project faced an immediate, really political and primarily also regulatory backlash. So from all sides, here are just some examples. So if you look at policymakers, members of the government, but also foreign leaders from Europe, and even potential competitors. And so I think it's fair to say that there were some obvious concerns with it. Now, too many to actually list all here, but I think you can actually distill them down to the following 5. So primarily central banks were concerned about Libra potentially interfering with their ability to conduct monetary policy, and particularly for smaller countries, even that it could potentially undermine their monetary sovereignty by essentially providing an alternative to domestic currencies. Now also the fact that the Libra reserve that would manage all the underlying collateral could potentially grow to a size where it would have a massive impact on financial markets globally, and thus global financial stability, was also a huge concern, particularly for regulators. And that's something we're going to talk about in more detail later. And then from that reserve comes, let's say, rather a large political power as well from the association. And the fact that this association is essentially comprised of unelected members that could potentially be non-accountable is obviously something that many governments are not comfortable with at all. Then also when it comes to compliance, so the white paper failed to address pretty much any compliance measures or frameworks, now which is really something that is unacceptable to regulators, because we live in a world where financial services are one of the most regulated industries on earth. And this project would effectively undermine all the global regulatory efforts that would have been essentially done over the last 2 decades, particularly when it comes to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. And then last but not least, I think the fact that Facebook was taking a leadership role probably didn't really help appease regulators and policymakers either, given its rather, let's say, dubious reputation with all the previous scandals. So it was not necessarily something that further instilled confidence in the project. So the political pressure really grew to, well, let's say, to a very high degree. And in the end, it had a massive impact on the association itself, because 7 founding members, including many US-based payment companies, essentially decided to leave the project, very likely because they didn't want to jeopardize the existing business lines. Now, also what followed was 2 very, I guess, uncomfortable hearings with for David Marcus, so the then project leads, as well as Mark Zuckerberg, who were, figuratively grilled by US Congress and the House. So nobody really knew what would then follow from that. And so it was actually quite a surprise, I would say, that 2 months ago in April, the Libra Association actually published a new white paper that really suggested a completely revised proposal that I would call Libra 2.0 here. And so I think you can summarize that proposal really by saying that it's a massive compliance upgrade that made significant concessions to politicians and regulators. Now, I'm just going to very quickly gloss over these changes because we're going to talk about these in more detail later. So it introduced single currency stablecoins, as well as a robust compliance framework to address at least some of those regulatory concerns. Very importantly, it also abandoned really that notion of moving or the goal of moving towards a more decentralized governance framework in the future. And also it suggested a very restricted launch where only certain participants would be able to actually join the network and interact with it. So I think what's important to take away from all of this is that Libra 1.0, the initial vision, is really something that you could characterize as sort of revolutionary new proposal for really a completely new unit of account that would be borderless, based on relatively permissionless infrastructure, as opposed to Libra 2.0, which I think is rather a natural evolution of financial market infrastructure, to having natively digital payment rails powered by essentially e-money, but within that controlled environment so that it really fits within the existing financial services industry. And that being said, that doesn't make it a lot less exciting, as we're going to see. So let's start with the analysis of Libra 2.0, so where we are right now as described in the white paper, the updated white paper. So unlike the first proposal, there's now not only one single asset, but there's actually different types of assets. So first we have the single currency stablecoins. And these are really effectively, as you can see here in the visual representation, these are just essentially digital representations of national currency. And so they are collateralized by the Libra Reserve, and generally there should be about 20% cash or cash equivalents, as well as 80% should be based on high quality liquid assets, like short-term government bonds, for example. Now, what this actually does is, in my opinion, it's nothing else than just a traditional e-money issuer. So that's exactly what PayPal and other online payment platforms do as well. So their internal tokens, if you like, that users use for paying on the platform is essentially one-to-one collateralized by a reserve that is composed of what we call near money. Now, what's interesting to note here is that the Libra system will initially only support a limited number of national currencies. And I don't really think that this is going to change significantly in the future, because if you look at the conditions of the collateral that is required and actually specified by the Libra Reserve, that actually includes pretty much all of the world's currencies. So it's only the largest ones that would actually fulfill those criteria for the high quality collateral. Now, what's interesting in the white paper as well is that they indicate the possibility that central banks could in the future actually use the Libra platform to issue central bank digital currency, so CBDC. So what that would effectively mean is that Libra could potentially become a sort of operating system for CBDC, which I think is not an unlikely proposition. And then second, there's still that, let's say, digital currency that's borderless, as it's called now, multi-currency LBR. But effectively, its role has been quite a lot reduced, I would say. So it is a synthetic asset, so essentially just a composite of stablecoins with fixed weight. Now, the way it works technically is that stablecoins will have to be sent to a smart contract where they will be locked, and then the smart contract will issue a corresponding amount of LBR. Now, the white paper mentions two main use cases for LBR. So first being a low volatility store value, particularly for users in countries that, let's say, have more financial problems, where they tend to have currencies that are inflationary and can't really easily get access to other alternative store values. I think that might be a potential use case, although for some reasons that I will mention later, I don't really think that this would be the main one. But then second, what the white paper suggests is that it could become the cross-border settlement asset of the system. I find this to be very unlikely, to be honest, because most trade today is still denominated in US dollars. So there's a unit of account that everybody is familiar with. Now, if you have a digital representation of dollars on the system, so Libra USD, why would anyone want to actually switch to a rather abstract unit of account, LBR, in which nothing really is priced in? So I don't really think that LBR will really have a big chance in there, because I think that role will actually just, as today, fall back to the Libra US dollar. When we look at the participants, what's interesting to note is that there is a multi-tier structure. So here's a nice visual representation, courtesy of Binance Research. So if you start at the top, we have tier 0, which is the Libra Association and its subsidiary Libra Networks. So they are essentially managing the reserves together with custodian banks, and they are minting and burning the single currency stablecoins. Then tier 1 are the designated dealers. So these are, I think, would be large commercial banks that essentially would make markets for the Libra assets and also interact, so essentially make a bridge between the Libra networks as well as the virtual asset service providers that are one tier below. So this is where actually it starts getting interesting in terms of usage. So tier 2 is what we call the virtual asset service providers, or VASPs. So these are, if you look at cryptocurrencies, these would be equivalent to custodial wallets or service providers, as well as custodial exchanges, where essentially users would have to open accounts, undergo KYC, and then they could essentially interact with the Libra network via those service providers. So the white paper mentions that there's going to be 2 types of these. So regulated VASPs that already have a license and are regulated in specific jurisdictions, but also Libra is going to introduce its own certification process to actually certify VASPs that are not regulated. Then the third layer, and this is really what distinguishes it from other payment platforms, is the unhosted wallets layer. So unhosted wallets, if you look at cryptocurrencies again, would be the same as essentially non-custodial wallets, so that you can just very easily create yourself. So you have a cryptographic key pair, and you don't need to register an account with any service provider. And then fourth, of course, we have the users. So those could be individuals or businesses that will then essentially use the Libra network to make payments. Now, the way that users connect generally would be either by opening unhosted wallets, which have transaction limits, or by connecting to VASPs or via VASPs. Now, if you recall, I have mentioned before that Libra is going to start with a very restricted, within a restricted environment. So first, there's not going to be certified asset providers. Essentially, it's only regulated VASPs that will be allowed on the network initially. So that also means that there will be no unhosted wallet functionality in the beginning. And so what this means is that users will only be able to actually use the Libra network via regulated VASPs in the future, well, in the near future, let's say. So there's no timeline about when these other actors will be allowed on the network. So that remains currently completely open. And so what this means essentially for the usage of the network itself is that users will all interact or actually do transactions within these virtual asset service providers. And so what is very likely to emerge is that these VASPs essentially will net out the payments between themselves and then only settle the difference using the Libra blockchain. And so effectively what this means is that the Libra blockchain, at least initially, will really just be a wholesale real-time gross settlement system, RTGS system, for essentially for enabling designated dealers as well as these VASPs to essentially settle the differences of their netted balances. When it comes to compliance, there's essentially 2 levels at which compliance takes place. So the service providers, I just mentioned the VASPs who are responsible for doing KYC processes, for screening their customers. there's going to be a compliance unit, and association members also have to undergo very strict compliance requirements. So I think what's more interesting here is actually compliance at the network layer. So first, the fact that the rules, so the compliance rules, are essentially directly enforced by the protocol, which essentially means that they can be automated. The enforcement can really be automated by essentially being embedded within the system itself, which is rather something new compared to existing payment systems, where really compliance is mostly delegated to the endpoints. And then also the fact that, like any blockchain, the transactions are, at least to some extent, public. This allows for network analysis. So essentially companies that will be able to screen the network for transactions to also identify non-compliant activity. And so in the words of a regulatory expert, so he calls really this the mother of all RegTech engines, which could potentially really set a new standard for compliance by really embedding that automated enforcement directly within the system. Another interesting take here from a lawyer called Gabriel Shapiro is that this is a very good, let's say, indication of what is possible in today's environment with today's regulatory framework, like how far blockchain companies can actually go to remain within the existing regulatory framework. So this could be a good example for other blockchain companies about what's essentially how far they can go with their projects. Now, I mentioned the concerns about the Libra reserve, so that large investment funds that will manage the collateral. And the white paper doesn't really address any of those concerns, to be honest. So there was a very interesting analysis done by the European Central Bank, where they looked at 3 different scenarios. And in the best case scenario, or at least best case for Libra, I guess, they calculated that the global size of the reserve could potentially reach 3 trillion euros, as you can see here. And so if only 18% of that would be invested in euro denominated assets, so within the euro area, essentially that would be pretty much half a trillion euros, which would instantly make that fund the largest money market fund in the entire euro area by a factor of 7. And so if you look at that global investment fund, then that would have the power to essentially move any currency or bond markets through the in and outflows by managing that reserve, which then could really pose stress on regional and also global money markets, which already to some extent right now are in quite some distress. Now, I mentioned already also before that the fact that the Libra Association, through its subsidiary Libra Networks, will manage that reserve and decide actually on how to allocate their investments. That gives them tremendous political power as well and influence over government policies. So you could imagine to some extent Libra Networks being able to impose or actually encourage austerity measures or cutting public spending and so on. So really deeply going into the sovereignty of certain countries. Now also because the reserve requires very high quality collateral, it could potentially exacerbate the existing shortage of collateral, which right now has already been a huge problem since central banks started their quantitative easing programs, which essentially suck out all the good collateral out of the system. And then finally, of course, the systemic risk. So if you have one or even the largest investment fund where there would be a run on the reserve, that would cause a huge financial distress. And I think in that regard, it would be fair to say that it would definitely be too big to fail. But the big question is who would essentially be able to come in and actually bail out that institution. So lots of questions and concerns that as of now haven't really been addressed. Then also about the Libra Association, so it strives really to be a, say, globally diversified membership organization that should be difficult to be captured by, let's say, national interests, whether they are political or regulatory. But actually, if we investigate at least the current state of the Libra Association, I would actually posit that it's not as independent as it seems. So if you look at the geographic distribution, so as you can see here, it is mostly Western dominated, and actually the United States make up 70% of all the member organizations. So I think it's definitely fair to say that it's mainly Western dominated and US based, which then makes me think that it could be essentially subject to political capture, and essentially something that I like to call become really an extension of the US hegemonial toolkit. So essentially being used by the United States government to impose and enforce sanctions on other countries. Also, this can then be seen as a sort of covered public-private partnership to counter really China's central bank digital currency initiative. So I think in that light, it's interesting to also look at the geopolitical impact on this. Then if you look at the actual industries in which the members operate, so here you can see the red bars represent the current members. So as you can see, they are mostly dominated by blockchain companies and investment firms, so mostly venture capital firms from Silicon Valley. Now, of course, they have, let's say, rather self-serving interests. So I wonder if their decisions will be taken in the interest really of the system itself. However, here I just want to stress that the association at launch is supposed to grow to 100+ members. So I think that it is likely that we will see a more diversified member base, particularly with more organizations from Asia as well, because it is really in the best interest of the association itself. Now, if we talk about influence, I think we have to talk about Facebook's influence as well. So despite all the efforts that Facebook has recently done to reduce at least the public perception of it being really a leader of this project, I think it still definitely dominates the project, although mostly indirectly via two essentially channels. So the first one is their wallet, which is going to be called Novi, so previously Calibra. And this is essentially a proprietary service or a VASP that will be the gateway for all of their users through all of the different applications. So essentially 2.7 billion users will be able to interact with the Libra network through this proprietary wallet controlled by Facebook, which of course gives them quite massive leverage over the system. And then second, so there's an interesting analysis done by Wired magazine last year, who looked at the 27 original members of the association and found that actually 15 could be really directly or indirectly tied to Facebook. So either through some investment relationship or other startups and partnerships. So this has changed a bit with the departure of some and the addition of new members. But I think you can still say that there's a sort of opaque network where Facebook really sits at the center. And so I think I'm already over time, so I'm just quickly going to look at what's ahead. So what can we expect from the future? So first question, will Libra launch? I think now with the revised proposal, it is quite likely to actually launch. Also the efforts that you see, new management team that has been hired, new additions for the reserve, the association. So I think it's definitely going to launch. So what impact will that have in terms of competition? So I believe that initially we'll mostly compete with cross-border payment services. So think TransferWise, Western Union, and so on, primarily for remittances and B2B payments. Once it starts actually integrating its stablecoins into popular point of sale terminals, then I think it could also potentially gradually compete with national e-money systems and even cards payments. And then if really it becomes that large system that essentially really eats into a large, gets a large share of global payments, so that essentially most of the settlement happens within the Libra blockchain, as explained before, then it could potentially even compete with national clearing and even settlement systems. But that's quite far in the future, I guess. I also think that the fact that we have Libra USD now, so digital version of the dollar that will be globally available, will actually help advance dollarization, which is a trend that we've already seen over the last decades, which then might undermine again the sovereignty of smaller countries, but also is probably, in my opinion, the main reason why multi-currency LBR won't really play a large role in there. Because if there is a Libra USD, all people, or residents in countries with financial distress, inflation in currencies, will tend to use Libra USD, provided that it is available. Then financial inclusion. So that was one of the key goals stated by the project, still is one of the key goals, but I actually failed to see how they are going to materialize on that promise, at least in the short to medium term, because there won't be any unhosted wallets. So users can only connect via regulated VASPs. The problem is that the countries that have the highest share of unbanked people generally do not have regulated VASPs. So I don't really see how, at least in the short and medium term, they will be able to actually bridge that gap. Also, I think there is a certain risk of the supposedly open network becoming a walled garden. So the temporary restrictions about not allowing, only allowing, certain members to participate, no unhosted wallets, only pre-approved smart contracts and so on, that could actually really become, so temporary measures, they could become permanent over time, as I see very little incentive from existing association members to actually open up the network and bring in potential competitors. And so actually relinquish some of the control and influence that they have. And then finally, again, going back to the independence aspect. So Libra is dependent in two big regards. So first, on the existing financial system in order to manage the reserve, but also to bring people in and out, so the gateways essentially. And then second, it will always be under massive political and regulatory scrutiny. And even if it diversifies its member base, I think it will have little choice but to actually comply or bow to political pressure, which, as I said before, I think will come mostly from the United States. And so again, sorry for taking so long. So with that, I'm just going to close it and hand it back to Hung-Yi. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Michel, for your wonderful presentation, particularly very insightful information for analyzing the Libra. And I think that is particularly very important given now so many countries is trying to thinking about issuing CBDC. So I think perhaps how could we really to integrate those element and to produce like the new payment system. I think that will be really interesting. So with that, I would like to turn to Areiel, because Areiel, I know that you work with IBM and also as the ASEAN blockchain service leader, and also now you are the CTO of the Block Solution. And indeed, myself is also a big fan of Areiel, and that's why we connect to each other online. So Areiel, we will very much like to hear your perspective and the feedback for Michel.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Michel for his thoughtful and excellent analysis. I couldn't find anything I disagreed with in there, so so thank you for that. I think that the question of the adoption of Libra is really going to be driven primarily in the SME space. It's worth looking back at the adoption of mobile money in general and at the two countries where there are more mobile money transactions than cash transactions. And those countries are Kenya and China. And what drove that? And in both cases, for very different underlying reasons, what drove adoption was the fact that small merchants accepted it. In China, that the merchant acceptance of that was due to the seriously underserved demand for commercial banking. And I'm not even talking about commercial lending, though that is also a problem for small businesses in China. I'm talking about basic cash management services. And the growth of the Chinese economy, commercial banks in China were not able to keep pace with that. And merchants desperately needed basic commercial banking services, and accepting mobile money relieved that demand. I found another way to address it because the commercial banks just couldn't keep up. In Kenya, it was more of a physical safety thing. I've lived in Kenya. Thieves in Kenya travel in armed bands of 8 to 12 people, usually with automatic weapons, and they are no joke. And the ability to both be a merchant and a customer without having to carry cash was nothing less than a lifesaver. two very different reasons, but the same effect, which is what drove the adoption was the small merchant. And I think that the question of whether or not Libra is going to succeed, whether it's in countries that have regulated VASPs or not, is really going to be about whether or not they can both in terms of marketing, so both in perceived and actual delivered value, get that value proposition across to small merchants. I'll hand over to, we don't have a lot of time, so I'll hand over to Pawee.
Okay. So Pawee, would you like to, we would very much like to have your insight, perspective, and also feedback from Michel.
Okay, first of all, thanks Michel very much for your presentation. It really can get my attention toward the ongoing project and also what it should be in the future. I would discuss further on the regulatory standpoint because I think it also should be very good to capture the recent development in the project, because as I understand, seem like according to Libra 2.0, they try to arrange the project to comply with the regulatory requirements, but it is also, how can I say? Oh, wait me a second. Okay, sorry. So I can continue my talk. So it seemed to me that according to Libra 2.0, they try to arrange the project to comply with the regulatory requirement. But it seems to me that it's still very challenging, not only for the project developer, but also for the regulators and also policymakers as well. Because this is not only the matter of regulation, it seems to me that it's also the matter of supervision and also to monitor the compliance and also to enforce the regulations. It could be even harder than to put in place the proper regulatory framework. And also I feel that actually it is that accordingly, I think we need close coordination, and also the coordination at international level can prevent for the regulatory arbitrage and also regulatory fragmentation. This is the first point. And furthermore, I think maybe also the that is the four modes of regulation that was proposed by LESIC. I think that it should be taken into account when we want to consider how to find the appropriate approach to regulate this kind of stablecoin, and also how to support the token economy at full scale. And I also feel that it's not only passing laws and regulations from the state, but also can be the use of social norm and as well as other indirect pressures from the government. This is also can reflect how government can influence the individual's behavior, and I think it should be good or should be helpful if we also try to apply this model with the case of stablecoin. And I think also we should think about the object of regulation, because I think nowadays we mainly regulate for the intermediaries that get involved in the, let's say that blockchain technology or digital asset. I think, but under the same model, I think we also can regulate for the end users. Even it can be like burdensome and time consuming, or we can regulate for the information intermediaries as well. And also another thing that I would discuss further is I found that a number of countries use different approaches to regulate digital asset in the past few years. But from the implementation of existing law, regulations, practical guidelines, and also bespoke regulation, the use of innovative regulatory tools as well as the self-regulation mechanism. But I found that maybe it also should be interesting to point out that it's not all countries across the globe that can adopt the same model, because actually it's also depend heavily on the social context of each country, and especially for the developing country that lack of resources, and staff with technology skill. I think let's say that maybe it's also not that easy for them to use the regulatory sandbox or other innovative regulatory tools. As well as for the self-regulation mechanism, I think it's also maybe very difficult for the country that lack of industry standard organization to run for or to use the self-regulation mechanism to regulate the digital asset or the stablecoin. So I think this is my thought on your presentation, and I just try to discuss further from what you explained about the project. And I think, yeah, I think this is my thought, and I just have, I think maybe one question that what do you think regulators, especially in developing market, will face difficulty to regulate Libra due to the factors that I mentioned earlier, lack of resources and also lack of staff that with technology skill. And also, I think this also should be the problem, because actually to regulate it properly, maybe you also need to understand it, the characteristic of stablecoin, even like the arrangement of the stablecoin that might fall under the scope of different regulatory framework, right? Thank you very much.
So Michel, how do you respond for that?
There's quite a lot to respond to. So
Yeah,
I just made a few notes. So first, I agree completely with Areiel that it will definitely be driven by small, medium enterprises, particularly merchants. The question will be how easy it is for essentially users in countries that do not have these VASPs to actually convert local money into Libra, or whether they can actually pay with, let's say, a foreign denominated stablecoin, which I would think would be Libra USD. But then again, we would go back to the question whether that would essentially undermine the monetary sovereignty of these smaller countries and actually further exacerbate their problems. And I would be very skeptical that the local central banks and regulators would actually allow that. So
actually here, I am going to disagree with you.
Okay.
What you're saying is correct, but if you look at countries where any notion of monetary sovereignty has already failed, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, what I think you will see happen very, very quickly is that the locals in those regions will find a way to accept Libra as a small merchant and to very quickly convert their pay into Libra. So Venezuela currency loses 90% of its value each quarter. So if it's a matter of saving your life, you will figure out a way, and feeding your family, you will figure out a way to do it. So I think that the early adoption, even without a regulated VASP, will happen in countries where there is a strong enough motivation to figure out a way to do it. Those patterns having been established, the regulated VASPs in other regions will look and say, well, this is how it's being done. But I think the innovators, the innovation will come in the places that need this the most. And I actually, despite the regulatory framework in Libra 2.0, think that this will still be have a profound impact on financial inclusion more quickly than not.
I actually agree with that. It's just and so that brings me back to the question about the independence of the Libra Association. So what are they actually subject to, right? So the thing is, what if Argentina, for example, which would also be a likely candidate right now, Argentina has capital controls, right? So would an association that is based in Switzerland actually be allowed to make stable coins or any type of other e-money available, and so essentially go against those capital controls that are established under Argentinian law? So what is the basis there? So would they have to face to that? So that's the big question, I guess. But people are always going to find a way, so I agree with that.
Actually, it's a great example, because I think that Argentina differs from Venezuela in that Argentina, at least currently, is able to enforce its capital flight restrictions. Venezuela is not.
That's a good point, yeah. Okay, no, I completely agree actually with what you said. And I think, yeah, people are always going to find a way, but that is probably why I think it would be really interesting to see once those unhosted wallets will be allowed to essentially function, because then we will exactly see that. And then I guess some countries won't be really happy with that, but that's for another question.
Hong Yi, can we look at a couple? There's a couple of interesting questions. Can we look at the questions people have asked?
Sure, absolutely. So I think we got three interesting questions. The first one, we have the question from A1 Paco Hopes. The first one, I think this is open for all of you, Michel, Areiel, Pawee. So the first one is, do you think Libra will be adopted in China, or is China's digital currency already too far ahead? So I think that is the question open to everyone. Areiel, would you like to tackle that?
Sure. I think that what Michel said about this being a competition for hegemony of economic payments. DCEP is China's attempt to disintermediate the dollar. If they want to invest in an infrastructure project in the Philippines or in Kenya or in Bolivia, they can basically say, we're going to invest in your country's infrastructure, but we're going to pay the workers in DCEP and removing the dollar. And I think Michel's right. This is the U.S. Unsurprisingly, given it's the U.S. privatized attempt to start fighting that fight, which for a large part they've let China have its way up until now. So I think this is a competitive landscape for payment enablement, and I think that DCP is further ahead, but the fact that the Libra will have a dollar stablecoin gives it a good fighting chance in that competition.
Right. So it's much more like maybe the new paradigm for the competition between maybe Chinese yuan and the US dollar.
Yep.
Right. How about Michel? How do you see that issue?
I wonder whether Libra will actually be allowed in China, particularly because there might be a reason not to give residents access to foreign currency. And so that could be another issue that I potentially see there. But then again, it goes back to the question, how easy will it be for people to actually circumvent those restrictions and use it nevertheless? And so that's why I guess that's the main reason why unhosted wallets won't be enabled upon launch. And so I think we're really going to see how it works once actually that functionality will be added, if it will at all.
So seems the discussion is much more beyond the technical solution for the digital currency, but also the structure and the political concern as well.
Well, enacting the technical side, building a digital currency is really easy, actually. Look what I mean. Not that I would propose using it as a basis, but look what Ethereum did with ERC20. It's not hard. This has never been about the difficulty of the technology.
Right. So how do we include the stakeholder and balance each stakeholder's interest? Maybe that is something we should consider about for moving this forward for the further next step.
There was a question about Libra being an investment vehicle to supplant Bitcoin that I would love to talk about if we have time. And again, it's worth looking at the history of XRP, which is Ripple's coin. The way Ripple originally designed XRP, it was never meant to be a unit of account. It was a unit of transition, designed to enable disintermediation of SWIFT in foreign remittance and cross-border payments. The idea behind XRP was that it was something that existed for whatever number of seconds it took for the money to get from one place to another. It was never meant to be a store of value. The governance model for XRP is, unlike most of the other of the world's cryptocurrencies, it's privatized. There's as many XRP as Ripple says there are at any given moment. They don't have to ask anyone permission to issue it. The idea that it caught the market's eye as an investment vehicle continues to be baffling because there's no governance. It was meant to be a tool for transitioning money from one place to another. Likewise, Libra is not designed, the Libra coin, actually 1.0 or 2.0 was never designed, it was designed to facilitate commerce, and this is what Facebook had in mind. Will it be used as an investment vehicle? Yes, of course it was. We don't have to understand much about human behavior, but the people who do that will do so foolishly because that's not what it's designed to do.
Right, absolutely. So Michel and Pawee, would you like to add for that? I know that both of you, Michel, you lead several influential cryptocurrency reports for that. So in terms of repo, I'm sure maybe both of you have some, maybe something want to add for that? Yes, Pawee.
Actually, I think I can supplement something about the regulatory perspective and also political issues, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think maybe it's also still, it seems to me that it's still challenging to adopt this Libra project or the Libra coin at domestic level, because actually we really need, as I mentioned before, we really need the coordination between the countries. And I think regulation and supervision should go together. And I think this is relatively new idea. And also, I think not only for the Libra, which is like a type of stablecoin, but also other digital representation or private token that maybe we also should think about how can I say, how to regulate or how to respond with these new things properly, because we need to balance for the potential risk prevention, and also we need to balance, we want to support or ensure the fair market as well. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I think we still got a couple of questions. So I think maybe I'm sure that will be very interesting to see those questions. So we have another question from Jordan Bidman. So the question is, assuming a successful Libra 2.0 will foster US dollar dominance in international trade, how should the People's Bank of China react on it? So I think it's a little bit connected to the issue we have been just discussed. So how do you see this issue if we position ourselves as People's Bank of China?
It's quite a difficult one to actually, yeah, it's quite difficult because it really gets deep into macroeconomic issues essentially. So whether China actually has an interest at this stage to open up its currency for international trade, or whether it still wants to keep it artificially low in order to foster its exports. And so I think this is more something about really, long-term strategic questions, rather than something that's necessarily just related to Libra or stablecoins, anything like that.
Okay, thanks for that. So the next question, I think maybe Areiel, you might be the right person to answer for that, given that your experience in Kenya. So we have the question from Areiel Wolanow. So the question is, what do you think will be the impact on long-standing system like M-Pesa? Will adoption be accelerated due to Facebook proliferation, or will there be a lag adoption? So what do you think for that?
Full disclosure, I'm in somewhat of a privileged position. I led the team that wrote the credit scoring model for M-Pesa. So I know the stakeholders extremely well. The preference that M-Pesa would have in a perfect world would be to shut Libra out and to maintain its dominance in the East African market. However, M-Pesa now has significant competition not only in Kenya but in Tanzania and Rwanda, and their efforts to expand beyond that have been stifled by other competitors. To that end, I think there will be a fight for competitive advantage to accept Libra. And though their first instinct would be to shut it out, what they will find is if they notice that Airtel or Equity or some of the mobile money competitors say you can use Libra with us, that they will be compelled to respond in kind.
Okay, thank you very much, Areiel. How about Michel and Pawee? Do you have anything want to add for that?
No, I completely agree with that. And actually for them, it would make a lot of sense to become a vast, essentially to be a monopoly within those markets so that essentially everything goes through them. So that would just be a natural, essentially, thing to do.
Completely agree. And in fact, given their relationship with the Kenyan government, it would not be hard for them to assert that they were a regulated VASP.
Exactly. And in the end, they wouldn't even necessarily need to maintain that infrastructure that I can imagine still costs quite a lot to maintain, right? So yes, over time, they could discard it as well. So I think for them, long term, would probably be a very interesting, we could say.
Agreed.
Okay, maybe the last question from my side is that now we talk a lot of the central bank digital currency. And I think some of the model that some jurisdictions, some country, what they take is much more like maybe the central bank take for, but another one is much more like the hybrid model. They also include part of the participation from the commercial bank. So how do you see like the pros and cons between those two models? Because I think recently I had the discussion with many people. But I think that might be really good to have your perspective on that. So, Michel?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. So I think, yeah, CBDC means lots of different things to different people. So it's always difficult to kind of like talk about it. But just so setting that aside and just talking about the participants, I think the key thing here to understand is that many central banks have two mandates. So it's not only about maintaining price stability, but also about maintaining financial stability, which is based on the health of the commercial banking sector. Now, if the central bank would be to essentially directly compete with the completely risk-free essentially deposits compared to the commercial banks, that would essentially blow up the entire commercial banking sector at once. And so that there are kind of the things that they have to balance, which is obviously not something that either the mandate would allow or something that would actually be in the best interest, I guess, of anyone. And so they have to balance those two things. And so this is why I think those public-private partnerships, where essentially they bring in the commercial banking sector, where their role is changed, but they still leverage the expertise of the commercial banks that know exactly how to extend credit, how to essentially serve customers, which is something that central banks have never done and probably will never do. So I think that is definitely a more sensible model. But whether we're going to see something like that, except for China, I'm actually very doubtful in the, say, short to medium term.
Yeah, so I think Michel is absolutely right to raise the correlation between CBDC and commercial banking as absolutely critical. As we discussed in the answer to the other questions, the reason mobile money was adopted so broadly in China in the first place was how underdeveloped its commercial banking sector was. And I think we will see that correlation play out. I think we will see CBDC be very successful in countries that have underserved commercial banking capability, and where countries that have successful and entrenched commercial banks, they will very successfully raise regulatory hurdles to keep it in a box, if you will. Until there is such demand that, they are forced to respond. So I would look for CBDC to go live, not just in China, but in any place that has underserved commercial banking needs.
Right. Thank you very much, Areiel. So Pawee, do you have anything you want to add for this?
Yes, actually, I agree with Areiel and Michel as well, but I think maybe I can supplement that. I think the way that you arrange for the CBDC is also, again, it's really depend on the way that central bank want to take or like, how can I say, it's really different from country to country, and I think there is no right or wrong. But and also I think it also should be good to point out that, as Michel from the Michel's presentation, because it seemed like Libra also intended to turn the platform to be the operating system for the CBDC. And I think this one is also maybe, how can I say, it's not that necessarily for some countries that maybe in my opinion that they can develop, or they can improve or prepare for the CBDC infrastructure by their own. This is my opinion. So I really think that maybe it's really depend on the country, and also many factors that you really need to take into account. And I think most of central bank and authority, I think they aim at preventing any risk that, as Michel mentioned for this question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think the time is almost, I think we already passed a little bit, but I think today we are very excited to have Michel and Areiel and Pawee to lead us in the journey for this exciting and very interesting, and to see how like the paradigm is going to be redesigned. So before we close today's webinar, may I also take this opportunity to announce our next webinar, which is on Friday, 12th June, and at 3 p.m. Beijing time. And we have pleasure to invite Mr. Junpei Miwa, who is the Director of FinTech and Innovation Office of Financial Service Agency, which is the Japanese financial regulator. So he will make the presentation on the topic, decentralized finance technology. So for those joining us today, thank you very much. And again, Michel, Areiel, Pawee, thank you very much for making today's webinar so insightful and so engaging. And I look forward to see you either in person or online again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you, Hong-Yi.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Bye.